So can plague be transmitted via the foodborne route? Well, this is a question that came up earlier this month when reports came out of Mongolia of two people that contracted plague and died after they ate raw marmot meat. Marmot, of course, is this in the picture. It's a type of rodent that's found in that area. And this is from the Mongolian Health Ministry. This was the first report, and that was back on May 1st of this year. Now, the Siberian Times covered this quite thoroughly since this happened right on the border of Russia. And they say, reports say a man aged 38 died on 27 April, and his pregnant wife 37 3 days later, and left their 4 kids orphaned. The director of the National Center of Zoonotic Dermatology and Medicine said, despite the fact that eating marmots is banned, Citizen T hunted marmot. He ate the meat and gave it to his wife, and they died because the plague affected his stomach. And they go on to say that the 4 children, again, are orphaned. Now, this drew some skepticism from people that know the plague, and you don't hear about foodborne transmission hardly ever. So understandably, there was some skepticism. And on one of my social media platforms, this was one of the comments. It says, I'm very skeptical that the plague bacterium was transmitted from consumption from my personal work with zoonotic disease over my 25-year career. Flea bites, handling the carcass of rodents, or if pneumonic, person to person via respiratory route. And yeah, and I can understand that. I see a lot of people probably were thinking the same thing. However, when you start looking at some of the research that's out there, you have to dig a little bit, but it is out there. There is some cases, documented cases of plague via the foodborne route. And here's one from Emerging Infectious Diseases. It says plague from eating raw camel liver. And this is from February 1994. They were investigating a cluster of 5 plague cases in a little town in Saudi Arabia. And one of the patients was admitted for severe pharyngitis and tonsillitis and a striking swelling at her neck. And they thought it was diphtheria initially. But Yersinia pestis was isolated in the blood, and the patient with pharyngitis died. And it keeps on going down. Here we go. The meat from the sick camel that had been butchered on February 13 was shared among 11 families. No other food was shared among these families. The 4 patients with pharyngeal plague were among 37 people who had eaten this camel meat. One patient who had bubonic plague, the man who slaughtered the camel, was among the 69 people who had not eaten the meat. Moreover, pharyngeal plague developed in 4 of the 6 patients who had eaten raw camel liver, but not in the 31 persons who had eaten only cooked camel meat or liver. And they go on to say, this investigation confirms that human plague with pharyngeal and gastrointestinal symptoms can result from eating infected raw camel liver. And they go on to say that even an older report was published before this, back a case in 1976, in a small remote Libyan village where 13 plague cases occurred after a sick camel was slaughtered and its meat eaten. However, as a source of infection, eating camel meat could not be distinguished from droplet transmission or any other way. So they weren't able to confirm that this was actually, the plague was actually due to consumption of the meat, but it did, as it said, proposed this method of infection. And then we have this other study. This is from the Annals of Tropical Medicine and Parasitology. And there was an outbreak of pharyngeal plague following the consumption of camel meat in northeastern Jordan. So between late January and early February 1997, there was an outbreak of plague in a small village of Azraq, which is very close to the border of Saudi Arabia. Well, the 12 cases who presented at the hospital were initially assumed to have tularemia, and they were all successfully treated with antibiotics. However, their sera was tested for the evidence of Yersinia pestis or Francisella tularensis, and all 12 were found to have anti-Yersinia pestis IgM. 3 dogs shot near the Saudi Arabian border were also found positive for antibodies against Yersinia pestis. It goes on to say 11 of the 12 patients reported that 2 to 4 days before their symptoms appeared, they had eaten the meat cut from the carcass of the same camel. 10 of them ate it raw, and 1 case ate it cooked. All 12 patients were diagnosed as having pharyngeal plague, the first cases of plague reported in Jordan in more than 80 years. Caused by Yersinia pestis that most had acquired when they ate raw meat from a camel that was infected with this pathogen. And finally, a rather large outbreak in Afghanistan was recorded in the journal Epidemiology and Infection. And it says, in late December 2007, an outbreak of acute gastroenteritis occurred in Nimraz province in southern Afghanistan. Of the 83 probable cases of illness, 17 died, with a case fatality of slightly more than 20%. It says being a case was associated with consumption or handling of camel meat. They did a lot of testing, molecular, PCR, mass spec, several other tests, and they all showed that the clinical samples and tissue from the camel all were positive for Yersinia pestis. And confirmatory testing using real-time PCR and immunological seroconversion of one of the patients confirmed that the outbreak was caused by plague with a rare gastrointestinal presentation. So, and this was the first reported occurrence of plague in Afghanistan. So, very interesting study there. So, there's 3 studies that I just pointed out that did show some evidence of foodborne transmission with Yersinia pestis. And let me just close it out with some key facts about plague if you're not familiar with it. This is from the World Health Organization. It's caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. It's a zoonotic bacteria usually found in small mammals and their fleas. People infected with Yersinia pestis often develop symptoms after an incubation period of 1 to 7 days. They say there's 2 main clinical forms of plague, bubonic and pneumonic. Bubonic plague is the most common form and is characterized by painful swollen lymph nodes or buboes. Plague is transmitted between animals and humans by the bite of an infected flea or by direct contact with infected tissues and inhalation of infected respiratory droplets. Now, plague can be very severe in people. Case fatality rate up to 60% for bubonic plague, and for pneumonic plague, it's nearly always fatal. But it can be treated effectively with antibiotics. And the first 5 years of this decade, we saw over 3,240 cases of plague worldwide, including 584 deaths. And the 3 most endemic countries right now for plague in the world are the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Madagascar, and Peru. So can plague be transmitted via the foodborne route? According to some of these studies, the answer would be yes. All right, I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment below, give us an up arrow, and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time for the next infectious disease news brief.
And don't forget to check us out at the website, outbreaknewstoday.com, the podcast, Outbreak News Interviews, which can be found on the website, on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify, and the Outbreak News This Week radio show, which is aired Sundays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time in the Tampa Bay area on AM 1380 The Biz, or online streaming at 1380thebiz.com. And check out our social media presence, Facebook at Infectious Disease News, and Twitter at BackDman63. Outbreak News TV is a production of The Global Dispatch. Copyright The Global Dispatch Incorporated, 2019.